Numbers, here we go. The book, it gets you excited, doesn't it? Just the sheer name of it, Numbers. Why would we want to read a book that gets its name from a population census that took place thousands of years ago in ancient Israel, amongst the ancient Israelite community? Well, the book of Numbers is a continuation of the story that we began 53 weeks ago, right back at Genesis chapter 1. And this is why it's helpful, as we've been doing, to take the Torah all together, because you don't get lost in the forest for the trees. Numbers by itself might seem a little bit unusual or daunting, but when you take it in together, you see it's a part of this bigger story that we are reading. So let's quickly reorient ourselves in this bigger story. Could do this in many ways, but I want to just zoom in on the promises that God made to Abraham back in Genesis. He promised essentially four things to Abraham. He promised that there would be land. This is the land flowing with milk and honey. And he told Abraham that it would be the land of Canaan. So to the north of Israel, to the north of Egypt, modern day Israel. His second promise was that there would be many descendants, like the stars in the sky and like the sand on the shore, he says. The third promise that God gave to Abraham was that he would have a covenant relationship with God. As it says in the rest of the Torah, you will be my people and I will be your God. Like a marriage relationship is what this covenant will be. And then finally, God promises that these people would be a blessing to the nations. All the nations on earth would be blessed through Israel. Israel was to become a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And I think it's also helpful just to orient ourselves in Numbers, to know what the other name for Numbers is. So Numbers is its name in the English and Greek traditions. In the Hebrew tradition, the name of Numbers is in the wilderness, which I think is a much more interesting name, in the wilderness. And that's because this book, it takes place between the redemption from Egypt and before the entry into the promised land. Israel are in the wilderness. So let's get into it. Chapter 1, the preamble, we have Israel left Egypt 13 months ago. Now, it feels like forever ago for us. 22 videos ago, we talked about Israel leaving Egypt. But for Israel, it's only been 13 months. Remember that the narrative time has slowed down as we've looked at the tabernacle and Leviticus and the back half of Exodus and the book of Leviticus. But these people are the people who left Egypt only 13 months ago. This is recent history for them. And this is an important thing to remember as we read on in Numbers, because we'll see that this recent history is quickly forgotten. But God instructs his people at this point that they should take a census and get a sense of how many fighting men they have in Israel. Now, again, this census and this desire to know how many soldiers they have in Israel, it hints at the broader story. Why do they need fighting men if they are in the wilderness? Well, it's because God has given them a promise that they will inherit the land of Canaan, which is currently occupied by others. And so fighting men are needed in order to take possession of it. So in chapter 1, we have the 12 tribes counted, and we're told that their fighting men comes to a number of 603,550. There you go, first census is done. Now remember that in Exodus chapter 1, we begin with a census as well. You might not remember it because it's on a much smaller scale, but as the family of Jacob, or the family of Israel, they enter into Egypt, we are told that they are 70 people. So it's a far less noteworthy census, but still it marks an important point in the story. And you'll probably notice it as we read through Numbers that a lot of the payoff in Numbers comes from a comparison with Exodus. Anyway, we have 70 people as they enter into Egypt. And then as they come out of Egypt, we have hundreds of thousands of people. So this is meant to spark in our minds that promise that God made to Abraham of many descendants. This promise is well and truly on track. Now, just a note about these 12 tribes, because as you would have noticed in the census, it numbers the people by their tribes. You might think to yourself, oh, well, the 12 tribes, they come from the 12 sons of Jacob that we read about back in Genesis chapter 30. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And maybe you know this, but I think it's important to flesh it out anyway. You might remember that in Genesis chapter 48, Jacob, who at this point in the story has been renamed Israel, he looks to Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, and he elevates them to the position of sons in his own family. So they are treated as his own sons. And so Manasseh and Ephraim, are their own tribes within Israel. And so they are numbered amongst the 12 tribes. Now, two sons replacing one son, because there is no tribe of Joseph, it means that there are actually 13 tribes in Israel. Did you know that? There are 13 tribes. But you might have also noticed that there are only 12 tribes listed here with fighting men. So who is it that's been left out from this list of fighting men? You guessed it, it's the tribe of Levi. Because, as we're told here, they have a special role. They are not to be numbered amongst Israel's army because they are to attend to the tabernacle. That's going to be their job. So it says in Numbers chapter 1, verse 50, appoint the Levites to be in charge of the tabernacle and the covenant law, over all of its furnishings and everything belonging to it. They are to carry the tabernacle and all of its furnishings, and they are to take care of it and to camp around it. So this is chapter 1. Chapter 2, we have a description of the way that the tribes are meant to organize themselves around the tabernacle. Have a look at this picture. This is an artist's rendition of what this might have looked like. We have the tabernacle right in the center of the community because God was supposed to be the center of the Israelite life. And then you'll notice in this picture that the tribe of Levi camps on all sides of the tabernacle. Aaron and Moses, and then the three other clans of Levi are camped all around the tabernacle. And then we have the other tribes around that. Now this chapter, it also describes the order that the Israelites should set out when they begin to move. Now again, this detail, the fact that they should move out in a certain way, hints at the broader story that is telling of God's fulfillment of his promises to Abraham. They are to move from Sinai. It's been 13 months since they left Egypt. They've spent 10 months at this point at Mount Sinai, and they're not going to stay there forever. They have a land that they need to enter, the land flowing with milk and honey. And so there needs to be order in the way that they move out. And so that's chapter 2. Chapters 3 and 4, we have a zoomed in focus on this tribe of Levi and a bit more of an explanation of what their role will be. Now, in a strange turn of events, Levi's tribe, so Levi is the third-born son of Jacob, Levi's tribe are going to be treated as the firstborn. So it's not going to be Reuben, who is the actual firstborn, it's going to be Levi. This is what it says in Numbers chapter 3, verses 11 to 13. I have taken the Levites from among the Israelites in place of the firstborn male offspring of every Israelite woman. The Levites are mine, and for all the firstborn are mine. Now you might recall that God, when he called Israel out of Egypt, he asks for the firstborn to be consecrated to him. And here, Levi and the tribe of the Levites are fulfilling that role. Chapter 4 describes the roles that they have in the tabernacle and the different clans of Levi as they should fulfill them. So, the people who are in charge of the transport of the tabernacle and of the furnishings and blah, blah, blah. Okay. Now, that's the details of these 4 chapters. What's in it for us as Christians today? 2 things I just want to draw attention to. The role of the firstborn in ancient society was that they were to be the honored child and they were to receive the greater inheritance when the parents pass away. Now, God always seems to have this pattern of putting others in the place of the firstborn. We see it here again as Levi is promoted to the place of the firstborn. Now, the New Testament picks up on this idea of being promoted to the place of the firstborn when you are not deserving of it. And we are told that if we put our trust in Jesus, we who have no rights to God's inheritance can sit in the place of the firstborn. We can read about this in John chapter 1, where it says, "To all who receive him, to those who believe in his name, have the right to become children of God." And then in Romans chapter 8, that famous passage, it says, "Now if we are children, which we are by faith, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ." God's tendency to raise up those undeserving of this place of firstborn, that is us. Amazing. Now, the other thing that I wanted to draw attention to in this section is that Numbers, it has a deep significance for us as Christians because we are like Israel at this point in the story. Israel is between salvation and final arrival in the promised land. And that is where we find ourselves too. We have been saved on the cross, and yet we haven't yet arrived at our promised land. We are like Israel, and we, like Israel, are in the wilderness. And the thing that chapters 1 and 2 are rehearsing is that in the wilderness, God is keeping his promises. It's reminding us that there is a bigger story here. And the trajectory of that story is God fulfilling his promises. So we, like Israel, find ourselves between salvation and final arrival in the wilderness. But the trajectory of the story is that God is keeping his promises, and so we should trust in God. Let me pray. Father God, we thank you that you are a promise-keeping God and that we can trust you. Please help us to do that this week, knowing that there is a bigger story here and the trajectory is towards your faithfulness. Help us to hold on to that. Amen.